Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. I always am in great need of your help. You can donate through the website, geopoliticsandempire.com, or, the best way to support the podcast is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. You can choose the annual option or the monthly option. We do weekly calls every 1 or 2 or 3 weeks with supporters only to shoot the breeze, and I do a weekly video format write-up and commentary of what's going on in the world. You can also purchase a consult if you want to chat with me for whatever reason, and do check out my affiliates. Joining us is Michelle Stiles, who's author of the fantastic book. I've got the digital version here, One Idea to Rule Them All, Reverse Engineering American Propaganda. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Michelle.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Excellent book. And before digging into it, anything you want to tell us about yourself, your work, and how and why this book came to be?
Sure. It's kind of an oddity in the universe, really. I was just struck by a local unearthing of corruption, and it was really relatively small anthill. And I thought, my God, what it was that moment that you realize, God, Washington must be just, because it doesn't filter down without. That's the maximal power up there. And so I just started, I wanted to research propaganda. And it happened at the time that Barack Obama came to rise. And I thought, he's a junior senator. He doesn't have the actual qualifications, experience-wise. And he just seemed like he was airbrushed, right? Not that was the first use of that, for sure. But for me, it just struck out. So I started... or stuck out rather. And so I started researching the word propaganda, and I got to Creel, the head of the Committee on Public Education, and he wrote this book, How We Advertise America. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
No, okay. So he's fist pumping right after the war, and he's 6.6 million to convince our forefathers to fight in a war they didn't want to fight in, and he's like it was the greatest in salesmanship, and I thought, wow, you should have good reasons to go into war or not. But to sell a war just was profoundly distasteful to me. So, and that's when I just started really branching out into whatever I could read and get my hands on. So, here I am 14 years later.
No, and your book is very well written, very well sourced. And even for many of us who are well aware of some of this stuff, as you just mentioned, there's new names in there for me. You go through some of the examples of getting ahead of myself. Regime change, right, by MI6 and CIA of Guatemala in the 1950s. PB success. You, in passing, mentioned Operation Ajax, Mossadegh's the overthrow of Iran. And when I taught foreign policy at university, the reading I would assign to my kids was the actual declassified operation manual of, I called it Peanut Butter Success. That was the name of the actual, the documents at PB Success, the plan to overthrow Arbenz in Guatemala. Just propaganda. So I really like your term. You use idea bullying. And that's our daily life. It's absolutely insane. At home, walking out the door, it's just they're just bullying us with ideas nonstop. I wanted to cite one of my former guests and my former professor, who was a senior UN lawyer, Alfred de Zayas, and he happens to be the great grandson of Cuba's president before Batista, Alfred de Zayas, and he said, in my chat with him, I think last year, he says,
we self-define ourselves as being democracies, although we're not. And then we invent the fable that democracies do not start wars, that democracies are not aggressive. It's all fake. As I said, we're living in a world of not only fake news, we have fake history, we have fake law, we have fake diplomacy, and of course, fake democracy. And there's such a veil. We are living in such a bubble. As I said, we are swimming in an ocean of lies. Our governments lie to us on a daily basis. And the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, instead of being the watchdogs of our rights, They are just the echo chambers of what Washington wants and what the Pentagon wants. So the result is that most Americans and Canadians really believe the propaganda. They have not come to perceive Washington as a rogue government. They have not come to perceive NATO as a criminal organization.
This is coming from a former senior UN official. So go where you like on idea bullying. What's going on with the propaganda?
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with what he's saying. It's almost like that little graphic where you have Nabisco at the top, and then you have like 200 companies underneath, and they're all just subsidiaries. I mean, that's what I feel about the nation states. They're just subsidiaries of the global mafia, right? And so I totally agree with what your professor was relating there. But it's a really complicated environment. I would say trillions is going into convincing you and making up your mind that democracy is real and the things we're swarming around in are actual. This is our actual universe. And so it's like, so my thing is taking people back in history, simplifying the language, because naming things correctly is super important. Like if you try to understand, how do we get here? What are we doing? It's like entering quantum physics. It's like you don't start with quantum physics. You go back and learn basics physics so that you can understand it. And so that's what my infrastructure of belief is. This is how simple it is. I mean, and I try not to use words like psyop, entrainment, mass formation psychosis, because it seems like mumbo jumbo. And you'll say that to certain people and they just trigger right off on you. You know what I mean? And so this is language like trust your eyes. Seeing is believing. Well, we know that's true, right? Doubting Thomas, right? And even our law system is set up to elevate the eyewitness over hearsay. So, that, if we can talk about that a little bit, and okay, so when I read Le Bon, who was late 1800s, it's like a playbook. You've read him, right?
No, so I've had the book, but I haven't had time to actually, I've been wanting to go read the whole thing. People should, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's so relevant today. You put it down, you go, oh my God, this just reads like he wrote it, 2 weeks ago. And so I just said to myself, all right, he states flat out, we're not using facts and reason anymore. So what are we using? And I just said, well, if he's saying it's so relevant now that what he's saying must say something true about human nature, right? Because they're still using it. And so I tried to put it into these categories, like these 5 categories. And that's like I don't know if it's going to come out if you want to, like, this is one of a graphic, and because I have a weird background. I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So in the center is the experience. And that's really the centerpiece, because that's one of, and these are, think of these as shortcuts to coming to know things. We can't research. There's probably about 5, you and me probably, and 5% of the rest of the population going to dig into something and use our mind and, research the heck out of it. But for the most part, you have to make decisions on the fly, and you're going to trust your eyes. And that's premier. That's, and that's why the visual TV is so huge when they were able to get that, because we do trust our eyes and we don't challenge what our eyes tell us, even though that can be so manipulated. Right. At any rate, so these 5 categories is kind of like, remember Frank Wisner said, it's the mighty Wurlitzer. They kind of play these things, and they're just common sense, simple, and it's ways that, again, in a small community, you looked at your experience. If you couldn't make a decision about something new that came into your environment, you would trust your experience. Then you would go to authorities, right? You'd go to your spouse or your wife or your trusted pastor or extended family and so on, right? And then if you couldn't still make a decision, you'd go, well, because this is a homogenous community, it binds people with the same values and thrusts to the outside things that don't matter or are less dearly held, right? And then you would basically just go to, okay, what's most other people doing and saying, right? I can I'm going to fit in, right? We're sheep. This goes back to Aesop's fables, right? With the emperor has no clothes. people don't want to be mocked. They don't want to be ostracized. So they're going to kind of go along with, a homogeneous group. Right. And then culturally, you get held together by the values, and these are more implicit. They're sort of, they don't really, people, a lot of times you have to go through maybe a lot of experience in life before you start questioning the culture you were raised in, right? Or you need to travel a little bit to kind of start to look at that from a different way. So they use that, like, for example, in COVID, what did they use? They used a Judeo-Christian or even like a Tao idea of, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? You can't take a virus into Granny and kill her, right? And so they really use that against us, right? And then the language, trust the hierarchy of value of words, and words encompass our reality. And I don't know if you're, I use Joseph Pieper in Abusive Language, Abusive Power, right? And he basically says, and it's true that let me give you an example. So I still see patients, right? And I saw a Pasquayaki, a man in a Pasquayaki tribe, and they're actually from Mexico. They got driven out because they were trying to steal their gold. And he said, I said, do your tribe learn 3 languages? And he said, actually, no, the younger generation are not learning their tribal language. And I said, oh my gosh, I mean, they're going to really cease to be Indians because you see the world in a whole different way based on your language. And so then I was talking to another guy who's a Navajo. Now he knows 7 languages. And he said to me instantly, he said, I know exactly what you're talking about. And no, it's devastating. And he said, you know what we call white people? He said, the backward people, because they think good is evil and evil is good. Wow. All right. So that gets encompassed right in their word, and the example I use in my book is, after Darwin and the material universe, they wanted to study man without reference to God. And so before it was character and moral terms, right? And then after that, it became personality and terms that didn't have moral, like patience went to low frustration tolerance. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? It's like, so it's stripping. And so you begin to learn the world in an amoral frame of reference, which is huge. And so, and just for example, in COVID, they use the manipulation of 4 different words to change our view of reality, right? I mean, you've been over COVID up and down, I imagine, right? So pandemic, vaccine, cases, and death, right? And so I come from the healthcare space, and I'm a positive TB reactor. I've worked for years. I test positive, but I am not, infective, right? And so they change the definition of those words so that they can actually ramp up and elevate the threat.
Yeah.
So
there's a number of points here you just made me think of. Years ago, I used to make graphics for Geopolitics and Empire's Instagram. I sort of stopped that when they started censoring. But there's one, I think this was in Hong Kong, where they're holding a U.S. flag. And there's a crowd protesting. And I'm quoting Napoleon Bonaparte, who says, so this is Napoleon in probably like the early 1800s, late 1700s, I don't know. The politics of the future will be the arts of stirring up the masses, which is exactly, Gustave Le Bon, and then other figures, you talk about Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann in your book. And you mentioned travel. I've lived in half a dozen countries. I've got 3 passports. And, that's one thing, especially you mentioned Americans, white people in the U.S., many who don't speak a second language, who don't even have their American passport, let alone have been to foreign countries. And you think, it's very, the corruption in our country, in the U.S., is very refined, white collar. It's kind of out of view. I come here to Mexico, the cops are kidnapping us and dismembering us. You go to I've lived in Kazakhstan, authoritarian light country. My other home of Croatia, it's like corruption. And then once you see oh, okay. It's kind of like once you experience that other culture, other languages, you see kind of.
Yeah, you see, the world changes.
Yeah, more ways of seeing it. And you realize, okay, it's not so crazy to be a conspiracy, to understand that conspiracies exist and happen multiple times a day, every single day. And then the other thing you mentioned, You were, back in the day when we lived in small towns, and now we live in this sort of one world globalized system where technology has made the world smaller, as many people say. There's no repercussions or accountability. So kind of what you were saying earlier, you've got your local church, local school, local neighbors. If someone does something, there's immediate repercussions and accountability. But now with these liars, this globalized system of propaganda, they say one thing that's false, and tomorrow, like, there's no repercussions, right?
Right. And if you think about it like this, it's like, well, you have these communities, and they're pretty isolated, right? Every once in a while, a horse and carriage comes through and tells them something, right? But the penny press, think about it. Penny press was started in 1833, so it was about 6 cents to get a newspaper before that. So mostly it targeted the aristocracy, right? And when it became a penny a day, penny for a paper, right? They created these huge big rolls, and they just, the stuff ran off. It took $1 million to start a newspaper at that point, but the whole thing opened wide. Could you imagine? It's almost like injecting the idea bullies could inject an idea virus into that local isolated community. You know what I mean? Like, you're almost injecting it into a body, a self-contained body. And so they went from, a paper in your hand, right, to radio in every home, to TV in every home, to phone, literally every hand 24/7. That's the kind of massive access to, and, so that's why, like you said, from the top down, that technology can fracture that, homogeneous unit that has a lot of integrity, and the value structure stays pretty stable over time.
Yeah, and I want to mention, I'm joking here. You by saying virus, you've lost the no virusers. I'm joking.
Yeah.
I hope people can just sort of stuff that they don't agree with, just let it pass over, and let's continue, looking at these different topics. But I also want to bring up, and I want to keep digging through, how this propaganda works. You talk about Le Bon's crowd management through just repetition of propaganda. You talk about 9/11, like, we've all seen it. They're just repeating it over and over. You talk about contagion through current of opinion, imitation, appeal to authority and experts, and also, these liberal globalist aristocratic elites, they hate us. They have great disdain for us, the unwashed masses. You talk about Walter Lippmann as an example. This guy was anti-democratic. I'll read a quote from your book where it says, quote, "To those who knew him or examined his writings, his anti-democratic leanings easily emerged to a friend," Lippmann stated. "The size of the electorate, the impossibility of educating it sufficiently, the fierce ignorance of these millions of semi-literate, priest-ridden, parson-ridden people have gotten me to the point where I want to confine the actions of majorities." And you write also, "Kudos to Lippmann for saying the quiet part out loud. You are too stupid for democracy. And from now on, we will be organizing the story to suit a hidden agenda for your benefit." Of course, and I've worked at elite, schools or universities, and I have, with my own eyes, kind of what you're referring to earlier, trusting your own eyes and experience, heard with my own ears and seen with my own eyes, my peers, the undergrad international relations students who come from the upper class, most of them, and the administrators and teachers, my co-workers, espousing exactly this view that Lippmann has. They have great disdain for the masses. I was even in a meeting. I've told this story before. This was when Clinton was running against Trump, I think 2016, right? And Trump won, and all of them were liberal leftist globalists. And I heard them say at a breakfast, they're like, "Yeah, we wish Hillary would have won, even like if we cheated democracy and got Clinton in, so Trump wouldn't be in." And I'm kind of like, listen, that's not democracy. So you're talking about giving up principles of fairness, and I'm not really, I don't vote. I can't say I'm a Trump fan, and I didn't vote, but that's just giving the game away. No, it's just your further thoughts on this disdain they have for us.
No, absolutely. And I I agree. It's, propaganda's 101 is going through the left right, illusion, right? That's 101. Like I was really disappointed. Many of the people on the right who read my book and they can't get out of Trumpville. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why I'm writing the second one, because I felt like there was more to say. But I want to read, if you allow me, I would like to read a quote by Graham Wallace. He was a mentor of Walter Lippmann. Are you familiar with him? He's a British guy, and he was a Fabian socialist, and he was connected with the London School of Economics. And so he was quite a prominent guy over there. And he, in the introduction to a book called Human Nature and Politics, he wrote this. So now this is in 1908. This blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. He wrote, "Popular election, it is said, may work fairly well as long as those questions are not raised which cause the holders of wealth and industrial power to make full use of their opportunities. But if the rich people in any modern state thought it worth their while in order to secure a tariff, legalize a trust, oppose a confiscatory tax, to subscribe a third of their income to a political fund, no Corrupt Practices Act yet invented would prevent them from spending it." That was something they tried in Britain, okay? It's like, we're going to spend our money and we're going to influence politics no matter what you try to do, okay? And then he says, if they did so, there's so much skill to be bought, and the art of using skill for the production of emotion and opinion has so advanced that the whole condition of political contests would be changed for the future. This is in 1908. He said, "No existing party, unless it enormously increased its own fund or discovered some other new source of political strength, would have any chance of permanent success." I mean, I was blown away by that. I mean, because, he's writing, the book is published in 1908. So you would assume that, he's talking about at least 15 years experience prior, right? Maybe even 20, that they have the means to control public opinion. And so he's basically saying democracy's kind of a sham. You know what I mean? That early, I was blown away by that. I think that's it. It's huge. It's like they cracked the code, and they, like one of the examples that Bernays gave in his little book, Propaganda, in 1920 something, is he said, the politics of the future, forget about logic and reason. A president, if he wants to, lower tariffs on wool, for example, this is what he's going to do. He's not going to go out and debate it. He's going to arrange things in the environment. Now, this is experience. This is stagecraft. Okay. He goes, you're going to stage businessmen to go to a important event and have them wear cotton suits. And then you're going to, publicize it. Right. And then somewhere else in the country, middle-class people are going to, let's say, protest on the street that the wool is too expensive. Okay. And then someplace else, you'll have paid a social worker to, interview the poor in, let's say, Chicago, and determine that they're freezing to death with, because they can't get wool blankets and wool socks. And after that's been seeded into the popular imagination of the people, then they figure, okay, that's a problem, right? And then the leader gets the opportunity to then act on that. But that's where experience is the primary. And so and that's where, you can see a false reality just gets literally spun around us. And this is the 1920s. This isn't now, right? People think, they start out way out here, and it's really illuminating to go back in time.
No, and I was actually just going to bring that up and quote from your book, but you just laid it out, Stagecraft and Bernays. And on democracy, this is just on that tangent. This is why I stopped voting. I think, the last time I voted, I think in the U.S. was for Ron Paul many years ago. But after COVID happened, I'm like, I'm done with this. It's just the mask. Like, I still can't believe people who still believe that there's any point in voting anymore. Right. And there are a number of people that I follow. There's this German theologian, Martin Erdmann. Shout out to him. He was supposed to come on the podcast some months ago, but he had his second heart attack like 3 days before. Oh. He's still alive, but he's written books on this liberalism. He calls it a metamorphosis of liberalism. He's got 2 books, they're right behind me. And he basically says democracy today, this modern romantic democracy, is a civil religion. It's esoteric, it's mystical, it's occult. And I mean, it's not what we think. They control it, and basically, by voting, you're sort of participating in this sort of occult ritual. And it's so far, maybe in the beginning,
Mhm.
it was functioning because it was a smaller world, but then as things just, they monopolized, they took control of all levers. It's just a simulation. That's why I don't vote, because for me, it's like I'm participating in a lie. It's a simulation. Like I use the example in Mexico where I can also vote as a citizen. We had the three parties. All three parties support North American Union, lockdowns,
Mhm.
Davos. Kind of like, what's the point of voting? But anyways, just getting back to your stagecraft. This is important because again, I highly recommend your book. And there's so many examples today. So you basically say that the propaganda experts say you can't just come out and speak directly. I think one of the examples you said, back in the day you had the fireside chats with like FDR and others, but a politician could just go on the air and speak at length for an hour. And it's like, you don't want to do that. You want to do stagecraft.
Mhm.
And just recent examples, right? This Palestinian activist in the U.S., Mahmoud, I forget his name. It's like, there's your stagecraft. Like, create all this hubbub about this activist, and now you bring in, what's the solution? Anti-free speech legislation. Referring to, you can't criticize Israel, or the border migration stuff from the right. It's like, oh, we got these border mass illegal migration, digital IDs, right? Here's the solution.
Yeah.
Let's bring in digital IDs and the
Right.
conservatives are going to lap that up. And so, yeah, just before moving on, any further thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And there's so many front groups and organizations that are all funded by them. I mean, I like to kind of explain the modern situation is like, of course, they have their hands on, what's coming up in social media and where the truth is leaking out. So if you think of a sort of a monolith, and here's a crack in the monolith, and a truth is trying to emerge there. I think they just basically put a front runner in every crack. They fund the front runner, right? Or one of them, they'll try to get their guy so that they can take that slightly off, right? So, if you're looking at, you have problems, identify the right problem. If you identify the right problem, you can throw people off with the cause being wrong or the solution being wrong, right? Or you can just misidentify the problem completely, and so they're constantly, that's what sophistry is, right? It's just this art of, anything that comes out in the middle, they'll get their guy in, they'll float him up the top, and then they'll try to take over. Just like, you want to fund the leader of the reform movement, right? That to me is Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, Trump is a latter-day Teddy Roosevelt. And so, if you have control of the leader for that truth movement, then you can control it, So, yeah, you have to look back to see forward,
I want to bring up this comment from my Substack, so it's not loading, but where is it? I posted this meme about Trump. It says, hard to swallow pills. Trump is a deep state puppet installed to usher in New World Order agendas you'd resist under a Democrat. And I'm just, it's that's a hard to swallow pill. And,
Yeah.
I'm a conservative, but it's like, guys, how can you not see he's got Elon Musk who wants a brain chip in your head, and Peter Thiel and Bezos and Zuckerberg around him now, and he's talking about 15-minute cities, freedom cities,
Right.
digital
Corporate cities.
ID, like bringing in the cashless system with Bitcoin, strategic digitizing the dollar. I'm like, my goodness, are you that blind? Get your what you're saying earlier, and in your book, like, get rid of your emotions. You've been programmed by the techniques that described by Gustave Le Bon and Lippmann and Bernays, and I triggered someone on they comment. They said, you are insane and need to wake up and unplug from the woke matrix. I'm like, I'm conservative. I'm anti-woke. Not sorry if I offended you. It's for your own good. And I replied, good luck attempting to offend a Christian Croat. Christian because I really don't care what anyone says. I answer to God. And Croatian because there's a great Nikola Soldo. He's a geopolitical commentator. He made a tweet last year that I've saved. He says, it's practically impossible to insult a Balkan person and make them upset because they've already been exposed to the worst possible insults from their parents while growing up. And that's actually true. You can't insult a Croat or a Serb or a Bosnian because there are even insults in Croatian that are so bad that don't even exist in English, and I don't even want to repeat them. And so it's kind of like it just
well,
rolls
you're in the perfect line of work then, because you're going to get a lot of insults trying to open people's mind because they can't see you. To your point, Creel said in his book, he was talking and he's bragging and he says, because they so plastered the information space that this guy, he's mocking him out. He says, this guy that is reading in his magazine that the Creel Committee is an iniquity of the devil, right? The guy who's reading in that magazine is getting my information. And his son is bringing it home from his school, and he's getting it. He's just, it's like and it was like, wow, that's they understand that in order for me to get the information, and this is where people say propaganda it equals lies and misinformation. No, it's trust. It is trust. They don't try to get to you through the thing that you obviously hate. If the left hates the right hates the left. They're not gonna convince you anything over that other side. They get it through your side. They propagandize you through trust, and like the Trump thing is so easy. It's like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we make that calculation all the time. And we it's like a truism that obviously seems logical and valid, and that's what he's banking on, right? Of course, he's like a modern day P.T. Barnum, he's just a salesman, and so people was like, yeah, he speaks our language and he's an enemy of my enemy. He's my pal. That's it.
It's funny.
That's how easy it is.
Funny you mentioned Barnum before we hit record. I was telling you to watch Jones Plantation. Mm-hmm. Shout out to the Jones Plantation folks. And they're creating a documentary called Barnum something. It's got Barnum in there in the title. I can't recall the exact title, but well, since you brought it up, maybe we'll get to that later. Remind me about why people fall into this trap of this propaganda, and then they can't snap out of it. That's part of my, towards the end solutions. But I want to bring up, you also talk about in your book, this idea of disinformation, right? We hear it all the time now. And from my view, it's so antithetical to freedom and liberty. To me, any talk of disinformation, malinformation, fake news, and consequently the need to police thought is de facto. It's de facto totalitarianism. When I was a young man growing up in the U.S., we didn't really have so much of that talk. I mean, for me, it was implied. In a free country, you let everything go, let anyone say whatever they want, and the onus is on me, the individual, to think it out for myself. Mm-hmm. I'm discerning it. I'm not having anyone tell me what is the right answer. I'm going to figure it out. I figured like that's how it was back in the day. That's total freedom, democracy, whatever, if it ever existed. And today it's kind of like they're trying to sell us both. You can't have both. So you can't have you telling me what to think and then calling it freedom and liberty and democracy. And that's the thing that really gets me, being a citizen of the EU and looking at those disgusting, wretched Brussels technocrats, the Frau Ursula Gertrude von der Leyens and all those other lackeys, and they come out with that blue flag with the 12 yellow stars, and they're like, democracy, for our it's like a religion. And it's their God, and it's this false, evil satanic God, and they're like, but we need to promote, implement hate speech and vaccine passports, and it's kind of, I'm like, who's buying this anymore? Just any thought on?
Well, I mean, it's actually a, it's like a prop. It's like the stagecraft, because we become the threat to democracy. Disinformation and misinformation becomes the threat. So we're the problem that has to be solved. Right? When the threat to democracy was the quote I just read to you in 1908, that was the absolute threat. You know what I mean? But wasn't labeled a threat, and we just papered it over with wrong words like public relations, right? And front groups and things like that, that these benign things that, I mean, propaganda itself is, I hate that word. I don't like using the word because, and I really struggled, and I didn't actually define it in my first book, but I think the term mercenary speech is better. All right. Because mercenary speech says, okay, it's paid for speech and it has an agenda. It has a purpose, right? And it's actually anti-language, right? It's not about you and I talking and trying to come to the truth or me understanding you, right? It's me just manipulating you and sending you down a path, right? And so you have this stream of mercenary speech that's given through mercenary intermediaries. Okay, people who want to make money would agree to write books, write articles, own newspapers, books even, and then so these mercenary intermediaries agree to spend that money and put that speech out there to convince us. Now, what are they doing? They're changing public opinion, but that's only the step just before the end game, which is they make money. So from start to finish, it's about consolidating wealth, resources, and power at the end of the day, right? And they use language or anti-language to do that. And so and here's the other thing, right? In order to change public opinion, you have to have reach. I can't get on my soapbox in my backyard, right? Even if you're in the digital space at all, you know how hard it is to get traffic, to get seen, right? And so us with our little mini empires, have very, very limited reach. So if I'm going to change a region's ideas or a nation or a globe, I need reach, and to get reach, you need money. I mean, it's the bottom line. And so without money, you and I can do next to nothing. And so this idea that we're propagandists and we're ruining democracy is patently ridiculous. But again, they're using it so that they can clamp down on speech, paradoxically.
Yeah, we are the enemies. In your book, you've got wonderful graphics throughout your book, and you have this marketplace of ideas where it says tyranny and free speech. And for free speech, it says individuals do not need to be protected from ideas. That's right. That's freedom. But now today in Canada and in UK and Europe and US, they're in Mexico, everywhere now, they're in Australia, New Zealand, they're implementing these quote hate speech laws. And there's now these terms of malinformation. So even if a citizen like you or I tells something that is true, but the government doesn't like that truth, you get deplatformed. I got banned off of PayPal for life, which has affected some of the money-making opportunities for me. And it's kind of like for malinformation. And so, I guess going further than maybe getting to that question, you talk about Le Bon's infrastructure of belief, 5 main pillars of influence. You kind of touch on that already, and how facts are not used, logic is not used. You talked about trust, rationality is not used, and a lot of us often try to use that against our friends, families, and neighbors to wake them up. We're like, here's the facts, and it doesn't work. It will not work. And then going back to the people who swallow the Trump MAGA thing, it's like, any thoughts on how to make a dent, like to wake people up?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all searching for that, but I think just avoiding the trigger words and avoiding the spaces that the guards instantly go up. So if you can get them to, like one of the things that I think actually shows fairly good promise for that is the healthcare space. I mean, I've been in the healthcare space for a long time, and people here in Tucson know that it's broken, right? And I've watched the corporate buyout, right? And so like you can like the word rehab is still on the building, but I call it warehousing old people for money. Okay, because that's what they're doing now, right? And when I speak to people in that language, they instantly know. They go, yeah, you get it, right? And so the corporate takeover of this entity, essentially it's a cannibalistic, right? It guts out the institution that it attaches itself to, and working back from something that we have agreement on to begin with, and working back and helping them to see, the corporations and their role, in basically gutting democracy. And are you familiar with Alex Carey, the Australian?
No.
He's a professor, and he said this. He said, there's three main things that characterize the 20th century. Okay. The rise of democracy, the rise of the corporations, and the rise of corporate propaganda to protect itself from democracy. And I would even change that last line to say the rise of corporate propaganda to eclipse democracy completely. Okay. He didn't go that far, but if you can help them to, if you can bond together on this basic idea that we know that something has drastically gone wrong in the medical space. It's not what how did it get like this? We don't actually get care anymore. As my friend says, who's a nurse, she says, Florence Nightingale has left the building. It doesn't work anymore. And so that may be one way. And again, I go back in history so that we don't have to step around these landmines so carefully, and we can just talk. And, they can believe me or not, but, trying to, defuse it by going back in time and bringing out older ideas. So we're not, running around, hitting tripwires in the contemporary space.
No, and I often, some of my methods include, trust, right? You mentioned earlier. So if we're trying to undo some of the damage, it's people who trust us. So number one, we have each other's trust. Also bite-sized stuff. Some of the alt media, truther folks, I remember 20 years ago, like your gut reaction is just throw like 5 pages of text without breaks at trying to convince people. I still see that stuff, and I'm like, who's going to read that? You're going to actually look like a crazy, retarded person. It's kind of like, you got to do bite-sized stuff, be very concise. You got to establish trust.
The message has to be simple, right? Simplified. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break.
And good examples, as you just mentioned. We got people now who are like, "Hey, the Earth is flat," and I think some of these are psyops now that have come in by these same systems to discredit us. It's like we're talking, and I mean, come on, flat Earth. I'm like, I'm not touching that. That's something. Yeah. Just any thought on these sort of psyops that are coming in to derail what we're trying to do?
Oh, they definitely try to do it, right? Because if you can either corrupt the message or the messenger, right? So that's why they put people who are just anathema to us now as politicians, because if you can attach a bad representative, you corrupt the whole message, right? You put Trump to that, and people just chafe at his. It's like I had a conversation with somebody the other day about Trump's meeting of Zelensky, and him insulting him right on the red carpet when he came. It's like, oh, you dressed up, like you don't do that to your allies. I mean, you have PR people that are with him when he steps off the plane to the time he leaves to go home. You buy him a suit. You don't bring him in and insult him unless you want to attach negativity to the message of all those bunch of Nazi, fascist, whatever, white supremacists, people. And so, that's one way to do it. And the other, what you were just talking about, is to corrupt the message and make it, tease it out of its proportion, right? And go, yeah, they're really over here. The guy that's, no, he's this, he's believing in, the flat earth or whatever it is. Yeah, that's in trillions of dollars are going to that.
You talk about, if you want to tell us in your book about your term idea bullying, and then you talk about Operation Sheepskin, which is this sort of infrastructure, these pack of wolves, as you call them, that's basically controlling our entire perception, and then Operation Spider's Web. Just if you want to tell us about that.
Well, if you look at it from Wallace and you say, well, we can create a governance system. Well, what is governance about, right? It's about setting a vision for the future. It's about identifying problems that may be coming into view related to getting to that goal, right? And identifying threats. That's where, it's like the sheep, enemy, wolf over there, right? It's the terrorists. It's Germany. It's, it's the left, it's the right, it's attaching. And so that's what good governing is. But if you can, it's like putting the bit and the bridle over the head of the American people, right? And you steer them, with these problem identification, vision for the future, and threats. And I forget your question.
No, just the
Oh,
operation.
so that's
Sheepskin and
operation
Spider's
sheep.
web.
So it's like this problem reaction solution people typically say, but I know that that's not actually people don't really understand that a lot of times. So like going back to Bernays' example, is you put stagecraft into the environment, and so you can ID the problem, and so long as you have control of that, you're governing, and no other, like I say, tribal elders can galvanize enough attention to change the direction that they're leading us. We're going to be, and as you can see, we've been off for 125 years. The rich keep getting richer. There's no middle class. The poor are in abject poverty now, and we're just we're headed in the wrong direction, and nothing seems to change it. The trajectory doesn't change at all, and so that's how they do it. And I think they just reverse engineer, like, hey, look at Ukraine. I mean, it's like, okay, we want your resources. Well, let's say, how do we get that? Well, let's see, we can create a war, and then we do, what I mean? I think they just reverse engineer. Okay, we want these things. How do we get Maui's, the Lahaina land? Oh, okay, this is what we do. And then we just create the problem, and there you go. And so it's it's not easy to explain to people, but you try the best you can, because it's so important.
Yeah, and you also, when you talk about Operation Spider's Web, you say it's essentially the monopolization of ideas and the capture of leadership in the learned professions and important societal institutions. And I've met upper class Westerners who I was just astonished in my conversations with them, again with my own eyes and ears, where they come from the West, where they're supposed to espouse these ideals of freedom and liberty and helping the poor, and they're like, oh yeah, I don't care that the government's locking down, and I prefer having money. And it's kind of like these upper class citizens think they are part of the oligarchy and the liberal globalist class, and so they're okay. They're like Lippmann. They're like the unwashed masses. I'm part of the club now, and so I don't care about you guys. If there's lockdowns, I'm going to have my little card. I'll be exempt, and I can pay for. I have the money to continue living a normal lifestyle. You guys don't. I don't care about you. And I'm just astonished at how really good it is. I mean, you talk about it in your book, but they've got all the bases.
Right. Like one of the things in the Operation Spiderweb, or how to create a false reality, is how to corrupt authorities or institutions, trusted institutions. Remember what they said about COVID right away? What they do? They got on that late night show and said, well, this will just be a test to see if people trust the science. So this was something that, had unassailable trust. I mean, people are like, of course we trust science. You know what I mean? Like, but if it's been manipulated by authorities, right, it's not trustworthy. So that's where it's like, trust is the relational substrate they require in order to keep this illusion. And so they'll work their way through different institutions. Okay. And you have to capture that institution. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the role of the foundations in the universities. Okay. So this was brought up in the Reese Committee, and the lawyer that worked for that wrote a book called Foundations, Their Power and Influence. This is great.
Got it. Right,
yeah. Okay. Right. So it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And so he put out into the world and released the ideas that were being that the press didn't talk about, right? Of course, but it's a wonderful book. And so during the Depression, when universities were kind of cash strapped, the foundations had come into their own, and so they were going to give money in three areas. It was political science, social science, and education were the first three that they targeted. Of course, they did the Flexner Report about that time too. The Rockefeller did the Flexner Report, which radically changed the education of doctors in this country. But what they did was they seeded money, right? So you can corrupt an institution, by creating a super organization, which they created these intermediaries in like the created of experts, quote unquote, handpicked, of course, that said, this topic's really broad. We should analyze it and decide that we should, this is how we're going to allocate the money in like a, like this is the worst problem that, this is the next one. And these were these intermediaries that would come into being that they created. And so they could steer where the research went And then they paid their lackeys to go in back and forth between the foundation to the university. And then they would attach money. Here's this big grant, but you have to do what we want and you have to use the people we want. And so this was how they get their kind of hooks into academia. And, right now you could call it a, corporate universe now that really works for them as their own private R&D. I don't know if you're familiar with Arizona State University here. Michael Crow is the head of it. He's actually the, I think, chairman or on the board, director of the board for InQtel. So, I mean, they're just wrapping public-private partnerships completely around the research. And of course, the Bayh-Dole Act did that. That was supposed to be something where little guys can, keep their own patents. And it was just a big patent grab by the universities, or I mean, the corporations, to grab the patents that were being created through federal funding in the universities and then use them for profit. Right. So, I mean, that's the tail end of it. But back here in the 1930s, they were just, again, beginning to seed money and direct that. And if you think about it, and that's your evidence for where you're steering society. So you can steer things to global warming. And that's why everything becomes, now I have all these authorities and I have proof because I have studies and I have white papers and I have policy papers and all these things to say, of course, we're right. But again, the game's been captured. And, people still trust that like it was, something, 200 years ago, and it's all been changed, but nobody knows it,
I've got so many things to say here. Just yesterday, we're at church having lunch, and one of our friends tells us her younger sister, who we used to see stopped attending church. She's probably like in her late teens or early 20s, and saying why. And she's like, she believes in Mother Earth Gaia. And she, climate change. She believes in the whole climate change thing and Mother Earth and this whole thing about, the God of the Bible, and it's false. And it's just like, and, I would see her, and it's just unbelievable now to see the youth hook, line, and sinker by this climate change narrative. And I can give examples from education myself. I taught at the top high school in Kazakhstan. Nursultan Nazarbayev technically was my employer. He created the Nazarbayev University and then 20 elite intellectual high schools which were trilingual. I taught in English and then here in Mexico. And no one questions anything. I mean, you described the framework. And so we would get at the high school, university, we're told, here's this project we have to bring in related to climate change or United Nations, SDGs, whatever. And the thing that boggled me the most was my peers. No one questioned anything ever. I'd be going around to the science teachers trying to convince them of the fraud of the theory of anthropogenic global warming. Right? They gave me a class. I would try to find ways I can put spokes in the wheel. They gave me a class called Environment and International Relations. So what do? I can't go too extreme, as we said earlier. So I spend a day or a session covering the official narrative. And then the next day, we'd look at the skeptical narrative. Yeah, right. And I Skyped in Viscount of Brenchley, Lord Christopher Monckton, right? He's like the anti-Al Gore. They gave me a class on 9/11, like actual university class to teach 9/11 and terrorism. Like, what do you think I'm going to do? We're going to we'll cover the official story, but now let's look at all.
You didn't last very long, did you?
Well, I did last a good while, actually. Okay. It's because I'm in Mexico, so you kind of have, if it was in the U.S., I'd be probably gone sooner. But I did have courses taken away for a semester or two. But my point is that none of the teachers, university, they don't question a thing. They don't question what are SDGs or the climate narrative or international relations official narratives. They just implement them. And so there's really like little obstacle to the implementation.
But here's the thing, right? Science seems like this pure stream, and that, the money that produces it is invisible to people's eyes. And so if you're not aware of the corruption, right? And of course you get indoctrinated, well, that helps too, right? Like initially in this country, they branded us America the Great. And, about right after maybe 60s, they started tearing that down, America the Bad, in the primaries. They couldn't say anything good about any of the founders. And so that you're creating global citizens then, right? So you're imprinting them, you're branding America the bad so that you can create global. So it's just a branding operation. It's just a big sales thing, to get the kids, brand them America the great, so they'll go to war and do all the things you need them to do. And then at some point you cut that off, and then they're just sort of silently moved. And the National Association of Manufacturers actually went after guys that we had really good textbooks in the early part of the century that were very fair and honest. And they went after them, the Historical Association and NAM. And they, like this one guy, Harold Ruggs, was in 4,200 schools, used his textbook. Very fair, very, told people really what the problems were in executing democracy at this point. And when they were done, 200, that's all he had left. He was in 200 schools. That's it. They wiped out. And they have a quote from this Daughters of the Colonial Revolution. He said, "It's not right. It's we should be inculcating them not in an unbiased way. They should just love America." So, that was America the myth then. As soon as they got the real, history out of the schools, then they could just create America the myth. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me, before I left, they were trying to, we were looking for books, history, because I taught history and international relations, McGraw-Hill. And it was like awful, talk about, globalist, corporatized education. So we were experimenting. I was still able to use, sources I wanted. Just one further example. I had an American high school student here in Mexico, and it was MLK Day. And for me, the most important thing is like the government assassinated Martin Luther King. And, I was shocked when I discovered the 1999 court case. I think Lloyd Jowers and the King family was behind this, bringing about this court case. And there's a 1,000-page transcript where the verdict says local, state, and federal U.S. government agencies participated in the assassination to assassinate Martin Luther King. Like,
right.
if we're going to have King Day, like, oh, civil rights, blah, blah, blah. No, this guy was anti-war, anti-system, and our government took out this, a person like Martin Luther King, who was a peacemaker, and he's got many faults. Yeah, sure, okay, and then one of my students, American student, couldn't handle it, and I was projecting on the screen the 1,000-page court script, and he's like, "The conspiracy theorist." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, right here's the court case from the King family. And then his mother ends up sending an email to my bosses saying, "Who's this anti-American conspiracy professor?" And I'm like, "Oh my goodness." So my bosses didn't care because I was doing a good job, but it's just kind of like, this is the kind of reactions that people get who've been so propagandized. And you mentioned global citizenship, right? That's where we're at now. I was this week mentioning on my news report, there was a university offering a master's in world government, effectively. Yeah. This is where we're at. We're at the cusp of it. And so now they're offering master's degrees in world government. And you write in your book, quote, well, the real story of the latter half of the century has been, quote, the rise of global monopolization, global corporations, global wars, global infrastructure like the UN, the WHO, World Bank, World Economic Forum, global propaganda, and the emergence of the global citizen. Most Americans have simply been too preoccupied or lazy to notice or care. And then you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and just you mentioned world dominance, and just your further thoughts. This is something that I often talk about because for me it explains everything. Their main goal with all of this is totalitarian world state. Your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we already have world government. Do you know what I mean? Like we have a local mayor here, and as soon as she got elected, she joined the climate change governors. I didn't know there was such a thing. And then she declared a climate emergency here. Nobody was clamoring for that. I mean, she's obviously running some playbook as a local mayor. And now we're I think they're already developing 15-minute cities, although they're not calling them that. It's these policy groups and these papers and things that they are already implementing at a local level. So it's. I used to think that they were going to have to push us far right in order to justify putting a bullet in America's head, metaphorically speaking. You know what I mean? And because it's a freedom-loving society. And I don't know, maybe the mask stays on because, the democracy mask, because it works. People think they're free, right? Like, I don't know if we really want to tear that down yet. I don't know if they do, right? So that may be kind of something to consider, I think. But yeah, it's been being built, right? All the COP summits, the illegal treaties, the UN things that they've been doing. So and I think they have as well many different scenario planning. They always do that, so that if they're looking at some certain truth breaking out, they can bend a different way. That's why it's really hard to me, it's learning about propaganda isn't enabled to be like predictive because they can always move laterally, but it's that we know kind of the whole cons system and we're ready for it. That's the benefit in knowing it, not that we're going to have ultimate predictive value because, like I like to say that the internet was a great idea because for cheap, they had us create a dossier on themselves. Or, we created our own dossier. Wonderful. All the people of the world will do this thing that would cost us millions of dollars and they'll do it for free. So we get 25 years to put our connections, our thoughts, ideas, our values onto paper for them to store. In the meantime, what good's a pile of data? What if you don't have an army to sift through it? Now you create AI underground, right? You bring AI up ground on top, when you need it. Okay, now look at this wonderful AI. This is wonderful. Now we can sift through all your data and make, like lifetime changes based on outbreaks of, we've escaped the idea bullies and we're running loose in society, trying to, share these, help other people and prevent calamity, right? I don't know if that helps answer your question or not, but it's and I think it's going to be really hard to say exactly where they're headed because they're just so shifty and can is it going to be World War? Will it be the who's that guy that Curtis Yarvin is going to be? Is it going to be the freedom cities, the corporate states, right? Are people that dumb? Have they forgotten, how the corporations treated, the labor in this country, and like to me, they treated labor bad. Then we got enough power to go global right after World War II, and they essentially from the 50s to like the 80s, they gave that generation a skim. That labor generation. My uncle worked for Ford. He retired when he was 45. He had the world, right? And he said, "You guys just go to Disney World, have fun golfing. You know what I mean? Go to sports games. Live the life. You will be out." Transforming the globe, right? Now, what happened? They used that exact thing to justify leaving the country and going to China. Oh, look at all these entitlements we have. Nobody could possibly be competitive with all this overhead, right? And so they use that exact benefit they gave to us to leave the country and go to Mexico and Canada and China with the car manufacturers. So, yeah, we're up against it.
No, and as you say, understanding the propaganda, I think we still can, to a very good degree, predict things. I often say, on one hand, it's so predictable. Like I always say, I demand better psyops. Like Trudeau announced he's going to come down, and I'm like, Mark Carney, they're going to put it in Mark Carney, the consummate Davos man. And they did. It's like so easy, just example after, with Trump, I said they're going to put Trump in because they need, the whole Biden Kamala thing was a psyop to generate so much anger to swing the pendulum the other way. Yes. And I said, because they need Trump to go to war with the Middle East and Asia. No one's going to die for woke, for the transgender rainbow fascist flag, and you're going to see numbers recruitment jump up when Trump comes in. I was saying that before, and now it's like we had last week. Air Force says we have the best recruitment numbers in 15 years. Like it's so predictable. I demand better psyops, but also, as you say, I'm on the fence with many scenarios because they're so agile. They can
Yeah.
because they control so much. Like when we talk about world war, I've mentioned before two scenarios. They can keep this slow burn of slow burn fire to try to achieve their goals, or they might take us to total war, which would still serve their
Right.
agenda. Will they do another quote and try to implement the biosecurity totalitarian state like they did with COVID, or
Right.
like
Or a cyber attack, or you know what I mean, that had major outages for long periods of time that would disrupt flows of goods and things. Yeah, right. I totally agree. They're very agile.
And you talk about in your book, you talk about war of words, God terms, devil terms. You talk about how does one convert a democracy, or rather a republic, into a tyranny. I also really want to recommend this book I bought 15 years ago, The Dialogue in Hell Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu by Maurice Joly, written of a Frenchman in the late 1800s. Some people say, I don't know, they say this was maybe used as a basis for the forgery of the protocols of the elders of Zion, whatever. But, in any case, I will say whoever wrote the protocols of the elders of Zion, that plan is being carried out, right? Whoever wrote it, but gonna add that this is a fantastic book because it's this dialogue between where Machiavelli tells Montesquieu, give me a republic and I will show you step by step how I convert it into a tyranny. And it's fun to read because it's a dialogue, and he shows you, he talks about media as you do. And so just, any other thoughts on some of those sections in your book? You talk about propaganda detective and some of the core events to examine JFK, 9/11, and COVID-19, or as I like to call it, COVID 9/11. And you say, don't be afraid to stand face first into the wind. And I think this is key. As I mentioned earlier, you got to have a thick skin. If anyone insults me, I quote retweet it on Twitter. It's like, you can't get to me, it's like, come at me, bro. Is that all you got? And so just, any further thoughts of things you think are,
well, just
important?
to your point, previous point about Machiavelli, I was just reading through the Prince, and, one of the things that kind of struck me, he said, if you take over a land that has freedom loving people, there's only two things to do with it, is to cut them in some way or destroy them utterly, which is kind of like it's like, oof. Because America, has probably the highest concentration of freedom-loving people, I think, just because we're so large, and it's like, okay, I think we had our cut in, before, but then you were talking about propaganda detective, and the question was, what was it again? How did you state it?
Oh, well, with propaganda detective, you're saying, some of the, for maybe people early on in this journey to examine JFK 9/11, COVID 9/11, and you talk about how, democracy is converted into tyranny. But I guess just, where do we go from here? And you mentioned, don't be brave, I think, to be courageous.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the faults with COVID, where so many people were cowardly. I'm battling going into places without my mask and stuff like this, and it's kind of like everyone just complies.
Yeah, and part of that is we just lack that infrastructure of close families, close communities, so we don't have that backstop that can help us when people are calling us crazy and nuts. You know what I mean? But one of the things too that I found really interesting is, and I think this is another area that we really have to do some soul searching, is this idea. Okay, so the two main kind of ideologies that have been promoted over the last, the 20th century for sure, is communism and capitalism. And in communism, you had this idea of they rejected the capitalist system. So so God and gold. Let's look at God and gold together, right? And so the capitalist side is sort of, we reject gold, no gold. You know what I mean? We're not going to just pursue that, but no God either. No spiritual, and that didn't work out well. You know what I mean? That kept bubbling up underneath the surface. You can't take people completely away from spiritual things. Okay. But on the other side, you had capitalism, which was gold and God wedded together. Right. I mean, it's axiomatic, you watch Fox News, it's God's guns and gold, right? Capitalism. And they all got melded together. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to do is, God first under gold. And that's a real challenge to people because we want our stuff. We've been very habituated to having some of the highest standards of living in the world, while people around the world are getting crushed, and we have a real blind spot. And so, in addition to being bold, it's like, okay, this is going to cost a lot. You know what I mean? It's going to cost. I don't know. My finance. I do this not for gold, because I'm not making gold in many cases. You know what I mean? I'm giving it up to write the books. And so you have to have enough people that are willing to do that. And it's difficult in America because it's just been pushed together. But it's interesting that the both of the ideologies are somewhat false in that. And, even though Christians would say, but they're so wedded to the system, I think Catherine Austin Fitts always says, would you press if, getting to the truth, your S&P dividends would go down, or your pension would lose, $10,000. Are you gonna press the button? Have you seen her talk about that? Are you familiar with her?
I've been on panels with
yeah,
her.
great. Oh, good. So awesome. Yeah. So I mean, that idea that I'm for the truth, but don't touch my gold.
No, and that's why we have the prosperity gospel in the United States.
Yeah.
And I would just argue, I don't know what to call it anymore. You had capitalism, now it's like late stage monopoly. When I was in graduate school, we read
predatory.
Books. Right, we read books by like Edward Luttwak, and there's Greg Palast, and you have like monopoly capitalism, hyper turbo capitalism, all it's just this, where even in this so-called capitalist system, I would argue gold is over God.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
God warns about. Love. It's harder to put a rich man through the eye. Was it of a needle? The love of money is the root of all evil. Not money itself; it's just a tool. But if you love it so much, that's your idol, right? And that's why the rich man has a hard time following Jesus. And I guess one of my last things here, you I think there's a quote from your book. I think you're quoting Chomsky. In countries where the levers of power are in the hands of a state's bureaucracy, the monopolistic control over the media, often supplemented by official censorship, makes it clear that the media serve the ends of a dominant elite. I saw you were interviewed on Dr. Mercola's podcast, and one thing I remember Mercola talking about years back, he's been attacked a lot, but he said that, and I agree with him, that they have this world government, as you mentioned, they've got their hands on virtually all of the levers of power across the board: business, corporations, government, institutions, school, food, clothing, everything. And so really it's a behemoth. And you talk about in your book, the internet has been revolutionary in giving the little guy a voice. Anyone with a computer, right, like what we're doing now, can get this message out. But a lone voice is no match against coordinated campaigns that utilize all aspects of media by saturating the public. And so you ask the questions, game over, or is it? And so, thoughts on the road ahead. I feel I enjoy doing what I'm doing. Is even, as you say, I could be making more money doing something else, but for now I'm doing this. I don't even know why I'm doing it, but and I also kind of like sticking it to the man, so to speak, and having been able, to get their attention and throw stuff back down at me, being deplatformed by the Department of Homeland Security, being important enough to be mentioned by the Atlantic Council in a hit piece on Associated Press. But just sort of thoughts, game over. What's the road ahead?
Yeah, kudos on that, by the way. that's props in my book. But I don't know if you can see this.
You have to lift that up a bit higher. Yeah.
Okay. So I call it the monopoly tree. And, basically, people, things on the outside, you probably can't read them: smart cities, SDGs, unchecked migration, climate change, digital IDs, gender fluidity. They're all leaves on the tree, and we can attack those leaves and try to pluck them off. But it's the monopolies under here that, the roots, right? The financial monopoly, just like you said, news monopoly. I mean, one of the things that Kent Cooper wrote a book, and he was the in charge of the Associated Press when they finally, kind of kicked writers to the curb and became the biggest guy in the block. And he wrote a book called Barriers Down. And his last chapter was Truth, ... the best propaganda. And he said, it's axiomatic. I'm going to paraphrase him. He's axiomatic. If, the purer the stream, the more easy it is to inject a taint into it. You know what I mean? And have nobody know, what's happened. So I think, so much of it is information and getting people to, to recognize these things. And we need to work on the roots, and at the end of the day, it's a huge David and Goliath enterprise, right? And I like the end story in Lord of the Rings, where Frodo and Sam, they go into Mordor on what is probably a death mission, right? I mean, here, take the ring right into the, Sauron's backyard and throw it into the fire, which, you're likely to just die. And so they simply and humbly do their part. Yes, we'll take this ring and we'll do that small little bit that might not have any relevance to anybody. And then the other guys, you say, well, okay, let's attack from the front, and we'll create a distraction. If by some chance these guys are still living, which they don't even know, right? They don't know if they're still alive, if there's any chance over there. So neither of them thinks, they don't look and say, will I be successful? They go, I will be obedient, and so they do the thing that, would likely just sacrifice their lives. And somehow in that, God happens, right? And some sort of bigger thing. And so, I know a lot of people that I talk to, they're like, well, and I like, for frankly, myself, I see these people and I've been promoting prophetic voices from the past on my Substack. And, it's like, you see these guys, they were so accurate, they were so on, and nothing happened, and I think, well, what's my own voice going to, it's no good. It doesn't matter. Everybody does what they're asked to do. And each little part won't ever seem like it could possibly have any chance of success. You know what I mean? You by yourself doing your own little thing, me, maybe whatever. But if each of us does our own little thing that doesn't seem successful, then God. That's kind of how I.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good that we're putting God over gold, in my opinion, doing what we're doing. And for me, the, truth has, since I was a teenager, again, I don't know why, and there's influences to try to pull me, people that I know, family that say, stop doing this, just go make money, make money. I'm like, I always use that. I can have a kitchen table, a pile of money, and it's like, now what? Like, doesn't do anything. It doesn't move me. I'm a minimalist. Like, I don't,
Right.
It's not gonna, a yacht won't improve my life. Like, it'll just be an extra thing to worry. I don't know. But, I think in the end, I believe God wins in the end. Good wins.
Yeah, right.
When that is going to be, I have no idea what that's going to look like. Again, from here to there, I've got no idea. Some of us might not make it. I might live to my old age. I might not, and so it's kind of like, but I think what's more important is our concern for doing what's right versus this, the gold, the material, which many people, most people, their primary is the material. No.
Right. And they know that. That's like the monkey, he has his hand in the jar, squeezed around the nut, and he can't let it go. And people, it's like, no way, I'm not letting my hand out. And so it's like a hook in the nose being led, the bridle, they, in 1893, they did the Chicago World's Fair, and a corporation founded that. And they constantly use the World's Fair, a fair, the word fair was, I guess, synonymous with like a holy day. And what they were doing at those fairs, they were depicting a consumer environment. This is before, TV and all that. They were depicting the future made as a thing of abundance and riches and safety and, plenty, based on the corporate, the continuation of the corporations to continue to create this vision. So it's very capitalistic and very consumer and, gold oriented. And so, if we can't get if we can't let go of that, they easily can lead us around.
Oh, you just opened up another can of worms there. The world fairs, there's all these conspiracies now talking about the world fairs, and I forget them. I don't even know exactly what they're banging on about.
I know that they're coming out of the ground, wacky stuff, that they're already there under, because how could they build them so fast? It's bizarro. But that again, the fairs are phenomenally interesting. Like Moses P. Handy, he was the head of public information. And this is, I remember, 1893 is the fair. So this is like 2 years before. And nobody wanted to come to Chicago. It's like a backwater it's not like London or Paris. And so you'd have to travel from Europe across the thing and then go inland. Like it would be the comparison of going like to Russia if you hit London. And so it's like, it was a big sell. Well, they had clipping bureaus. Are you familiar with clipping bureaus? It's like early reputation management. So they got in all the newspapers from the world and they would have people read through and go, oh, this one said a bad thing about us. Okay. So they would follow that up and kind of correct that reputation. They had a mailing list of 40,000 people that they were mailing to across the world, multiple mailings. And at any given day, their postage might be $1,000. I mean, and so then they had speakers bureaus and they had everything, all this publicity, all these things that were coming on. They were learning how to do this thing, right? And the corporations understood it, knew it, and threw tons of money at it. And so these were major events. I mean, they were like a religious rite, a spectacle large enough to captivate the religious awe of people. So yeah, but now you're right. They're taking it and they're making it some sort of,
I don't know what they say today. They say like it's an example of some civilization existed before us, Tartaria. I don't know what.
Yes.
I don't deal.
Yeah,
with
I just put yeah. It's these are sophists. These are mercenary intermediaries that are getting paid to like promote nonsense, and people spend time wading through it. So,
well, that's the problem, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So, kind of the work you did with the book was like, okay, we see mostly all of this is a lie or some manipulated reality, but there's still a baby in the bathwater. You throw out the bathwater, but you keep the baby, right? And so.
Yeah.
I think we have to be, there's got to be nuance and being careful with parsing through all of this. So if you got any final thought, and then all of your links are in the description. Your website is smart sheep with an E at the end, SHEEPE.com. Where are the best places to find you and all that?
Mostly I'm on Substack and that website. I do have a study guide. And so one of my original reasons for creating this book was that because this isn't something you want other people teaching your kids. So I created the study guide to go along with the book so that they could kind of do a deep dive together and have these messy conversations amongst their kids about what reality is and what kind of thing they're living in, because obviously they're so tracked into the phone. From the time, and even if you're a good mom or dad and you try to restrict that, they still have friends and you can't, keep them in a bubble. So they need to know what, the infrastructure of belief, understand how it's being done to use those shortcuts that were very valuable in small communities, but that have been hacked from the top and can, be used to lead them anywhere that they want us to go.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, that earlier example of someone I knew, this young lady who, the smartphones and the internet, it's a military weapon, right? It was created by the military and it's being used now, and it's literally rewiring people's brains. They'll make you believe whatever they want you to believe. Some of us have managed to snap out of it, others not. And again, the book, One Idea to Rule Them All, Reverse Engineering American Propaganda. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Michelle.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.